Welcome to Resiliency Redefined. I'm your host, Robyne, and I am thrilled to share with you information about resiliency, well-being, performance, education, business, parenting, and everything in between. I'm committed to joining you each week to talk about these big ideas and bring them into action, habits, tools, strategies, tactics that allow us to finally uncover what it takes to truly be well. And I'm just so excited that you're here. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Resiliency Redefined. Thank you for hitting play. Thank you for choosing to spend time as we can dive into these big ideas. Now, how I want to frame our conversation today is very much this introduction to the notion of stressing wisely. So you might be familiar with my work. Stress Wisely was my second book that was published last year. And it talked about the framework that essentially is this like blueprint on how we are able to navigate each and every season of our lives. To get us started to this kind of into this conversation, I actually want to read from that book a passage that I think really helps us transition from looking at resiliency in the sense of resiliency for like resiliency's sake, which isn't what it's about. We don't practice resiliency for resiliency's sake. People practice resiliency so they can feel okay again, that they know and they trust that all will be well. So I want to kind of frame this for you, and I thought the best way to do it is to share it from the book. So bear with me. Here we go. Telling someone to be resilient or self-care themselves back to good when the world is on fire is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It might stop the bleed for a millisecond, but the injury needs a proper intervention. As a scholar of resiliency and wellness, I am deeply concerned about how resiliency and wellness are being weaponized. Amid systems of corruption and social injustices, telling people just to, quote, be more resilient or to up their self-care is cruel. The reality is that governments, organizations, system companies also need to carry the responsibility in addressing the demands of their people. The demands are rising and our supply of self-care is not proportionate. Professional care is also needed. Self-care, what we bring. Professional care is what organizations or communities can do to mitigate and address the stress. Perhaps you've heard the old adage that calm seas don't make strong sailors. Well, my friend, this is very true. Yet being in the storm and letting it knock you around is not what makes the sailor strong. Rather, a constellation of variables working concurrently does. Honoring the mighty force of nature while knowing how to trust your instincts and use key techniques and strategies to keep going is what keeps us alive. Navigating through storms also requires leaning into prior knowledge and lived experiences while being open and nimble so you can apply, execute, evaluate, adjust, and persist, all while the waves are crashing over the front of your boat. Navigating through storms involves knowing how, above all else, to meet the waves head on, bow forward, because when the waves hit us from the sides or from behind, we're likely going under. The same is true for stress. Simply being in hard times or situations doesn't make us any better at managing stress. It is what we do before, during, and after the experience that fosters and strengthens our resolve and capacity. This is what my work on learning how to stress wisely is all about. So the reason I chose to share that passage with you is so often, and I've shared this before already on the podcast, that, telling someone who's going through something like, oh, wow, you're so resilient, that doesn't feel like a compliment. Or on the other side, telling someone you just need to be more resilient or level up your self-care, that doesn't help either. So when we think about the practices that are involved in stressing wisely, again, it's very much how we show up before, during, and after a difficult season or a difficult situation or a difficult encounter. So my invitation for you When we think about this practice of stressing wisely, it's to first perhaps come to that place of recognition and awareness that stress is inevitable. And you might notice that life is hard. That doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. Just the simple nature of being a human is difficult. It's complicated, especially that we're doing it in community with other people who also have their own thoughts and feelings and lived experiences and stories. So, when we think about this practice of resiliency and that practice of stressing wisely, they're braided together with our behavior, with our thoughts, with our feelings, and very much how we show up. So, the first big idea I want to position us in this conversation is also to recognize that there is other people who are also responsible for general practices of resiliency and well-being. And what I mean by that, again, that idea that, telling people they just have to up their self-care when they're putting them in difficult situations, that's mean. It's downright cruel. So, for example, I recall being in a difficult situation when I used to work in post-secondary, and I remember being very offended by very inappropriate feedback that was I was given. Now, because as I shared before, I'm hypersensitive to feedback. It's part of the nature of my ADHD. Like I feel feedback as criticism, like in my bones. So as this person was giving me what felt like inappropriate feedback, my first perspective check in on that was that I was doing something wrong. Right. Because I always, again, was operating from the place that it's likely me. But when I took a moment and I kind of re-regulated and I realized like, no, what they were saying was actually mean. What was fascinating when I tried to set up a boundary and say, hey, I don't think it's okay that you're talking to me like this, the feedback I was given in that moment is maybe try being more resilient. Why don't you try being a little bit thicker skinned? If you want to make it in this field, you're going to have to toughen up. And I do believe that's a reality for lots of people in lots of different situations, that sometimes we're actually mistreated. And part of the practice of gaslighting is to make the person feel as though they have done something wrong. And it might not just be in the moment, it could be actually like building up in terms of how we have these interactions. So it's like they plant seeds along the way. And then all of a sudden it's like, wow, yes, for example, again, in this particular scenario, I had shared with this person that I'm hypersensitive to feedback. And so when the feedback came in that, again, didn't feel good and it was actually mean, and I said, hey, not good, their response also was along the line, well, you're not very good at taking feedback. So of course you're going to think that this is mean, but this is just really what, I'm just telling you as it is, right? I'm being honest. My gentle pause on that one is like brutal honesty does not like excuse people being disrespectful. It's kind of like good intentions isn't this Windex for hurt feelings, right? If somebody says, oh, I never intended to hurt you, well, doesn't matter. I am hurt, right? But so often we use this like notion of like, well, I didn't mean to, or, maybe you're just being super sensitive in this idea that we're supposed to somehow get tougher or stronger or manage up in this situation where I was feeling as though I was being mistreated. So again, I want to hold space to recognize that it isn't all on your shoulders to like be able to carry the weight of the world with just two hands. There are systems at place when we think of social injustices, when we think of how even just some organizations operate, like it's not okay. And my invitation on that note for you is the reality is like if you're on the wrong track, get off at the first station. The return fare will always cost you more the longer you stay in situations that you have outgrown or have served their purpose, right? You might have also heard of that kind of idea that like people come in our lives for like a season or a reason. And maybe some of them are forever, which is awesome. And sometimes I think learning how to leave or let go sooner is actually probably a better choice. And again, as I've shared before, the notion of like, when they say, hey, Robyne, what information would you give your younger self? It absolutely would be that. Don't stick around in situations in the name of resiliency. right? Don't stick around in situations in the name of being like, oh, I'm strong enough. I'm well resourced enough. I'm going to figure this out. Or, you know what? I need to just like finish what I started because I don't want to leave something half finished, all in the name of being a resilient person. You know, deep in your bones when it's time to move on. Whether that's a job, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a situation, or maybe it's even like a version of you that no longer exists, right? We kind of, and this is so cool. I love this idea. We, in so many situations, stay trapped in like other people's minds in the season that we walked into that person's life. Okay, let me explain that again. So, for example, if you look at like a tricky, work situation, and you think about where you were at when you started at that position. Maybe you didn't have all the skills yet, or maybe you hadn't leveled up, or perhaps you didn't have the experience. What we see so often in organizational psychology is, however, like wherever you were at when that person first met you, they're likely to hold you almost in this like time freeze that's what you're all about. Even though you might have more experience, you might have, again, leveled up or skilled up, they're still always going to view you at when they met you. So that's kind of one idea. Now, that happens in workplaces. It also happens in like family dynamics, right? It happens in relationships. The other area, which I also think is fascinating, especially for chatting about like gaslighters and difficult people, is that the other place where some people like to hold you, kind of like freeze framed, is the season or the time that they held the most power over you. Okay. And this is very true of relationships, that they hold you in the season where they had the most power over you. So let's say in like, I don't know, like a sibling dynamic, and you perhaps had a difficult go, and your sibling like doesn't let you or like give you permission to evolve or to grow or to level up. They hold you in that kind of mindset of like you are stuck in that time again when they had the most power over you. Same in relationships, right? When we see complicated relationship dynamics in romantic relationships, and there's a propensity for people to hold you in time when they had the most power over you. Okay, back on track, moving into this idea of resiliency, holding space, that this isn't all on your shoulders. There's other factors, there's other dynamics at play. Now, the notion of stressing wisely, I really love how in that first part of the book, what I read you about this notion that like calm seas don't make strong sailors. We know that to be true, right? If you are just like smooth sailing through life, chances are you're not going to learn some of those solving skills, or chances are you won't have to build the capacity or that threshold to be able to learn how to see yourself as the most resilient version of yourself, or where you're able to tap into some of those skills or beliefs or values. So, what that means is essentially like we have to go through stuff, and life inevitably will give us lots of trials, lots of reps, lots of experiences for us to practice. Now, a question I often get asked by parents and supporters and guardians is, does my child have to go through hard times to be able to learn this? And my wish is that, like, no, we can learn a lot vicariously, right? We can learn a lot by the stories that we listen to. We can learn a lot from even the shows. We can learn a lot through like sports. There's other ways that children can learn that like ethic, that work ethic, to be able to keep showing up. Is there a place where if a child has never experienced adversity, will they be able to practice resiliency? And the reality is I don't know. I haven't seen anyone yet that I have crossed paths with who like doesn't have some type of something in their story. What I have seen is when, for example, when I was teaching at university, and we had students who never experienced any academic challenges, who never experienced any like social or relationship challenges. Like they literally much found this pristine way through toddlerhood and school agehood and adolescence, and they end up in first year university. And then they get their first like failed assignment or a fight with a roommate or a relationship goes south and they really, really struggled. Like if the first time that they need to practice resiliency is when they're also for the first time like away from home and navigating all these other stressors, like that's like the stakes are really high in that situation. When they're little, children, their problems tend to be littler and the consequences tend to be smaller. But if they wait until adolescence or, early adulthood to start practicing resiliency and this practice of being able to stress wisely, I do think that learning tends to be more difficult because they haven't again built some of those skill sets, built that efficacy or that confidence they can do it. So this isn't me wishing hardship and difficult seasons on everybody. It's recognizing that there's some skills and behaviors and practices that really speak to someone's ability to navigate hard things. Now, I'll give you a quick example just because I always find this helpful when, especially when I'm working with parents and supporters, is I recall early in kind of my parenting experience that there was a lot of talk at the time about what they called helicopter parents. Now, helicopter parenting was this notion that the child would go into the world and the parent was always just kind of hovering above. And as soon as there was a problem, as soon as there was a stressor or upset, that parent would swoosh in and rescue that child. What I started to see, and I've seen in the last decade, is we don't see helicopter parents as much. What we see is what we call like Zamboni parents if you live in Canada, or lawnmower parents if you don't live in a cold climate, which means instead of being in the background, ready to jump in when problems arise, parents and supporters are actually getting out ahead of the child and similar to a Zamboni or a lawnmower, like creating this pristine path so the child never experience heartache or setbacks. An example, let's say as a parent, you hear that the child is going to have a very difficult teacher in, let's say, grade two, right? The word on the street is this teacher's, a difficult teacher. Instead of the child going into that class and like learning or experiencing it or kind of getting, a sense of what that interaction's like, you like go and like make a request to put the child in another class to go with the teacher that apparently is easier. So like the child didn't even know that they could have ended up in a class with maybe without friends or in a class where, this teacher tends to be more difficult. And so the child just is like always protected. And that raises the point of the idea about being a rescuer versus a supporter as a parent, or even in with our partners, being a rescuer or supporter. Now, there's also a difference between like risk and danger. So like going into a class with a difficult teacher, I would say isn't likely dangerous. It might be a little risky, right? It might be a little risky if you've heard the rumors that, this teacher perhaps, doesn't like a particular type of student. It could be a little bit risky, but it wouldn't be dangerous. And helping a child learn how to cope in real time and how to process emotion and how to kind of navigate these things is going to set them up for success. So again, I'm not suggesting we throw them out, throw the kids out to the lions. What I am suggesting is that we trust that we, as their supporters and their guardians, are able to show up for them in a way where they will then learn the skills to be able to show up for themselves. And I think one of the kind of greatest practices that we can do with our children is to let them know that we believe in them, that we trust that they're able to figure things out, that, this might be difficult, but you can do hard things. You are able to figure things out. And I think all of those practices really contribute to setting them up for long-term success, setting them up to be able to navigate those difficult seasons as they grow and as they progress in age. Okay, my friends. So this is just, again, a little bit of an onboarding idea to understanding that relationship between resiliency and understanding our stress systems. Now, next day, I'll take a deep dive into like what actually stress wisely looks like. What are those 8 realms? How do we cultivate each one of them? What are the things we want to be thinking about for ourselves and for others, especially for our littles? And again, I just really want to position this and hold space for you that like if you're navigating a lot of big things in the world, you don't have to figure it out all at once. Just knowing that you are well resourced, knowing that it's not solely your responsibility. And if you find yourself in this like cluster of difficulty and this cluster of challenge and stressors, that doesn't mean like there's something wrong with you. It means you have a life. And chances are you're pushing some of those boundaries. You're living big, bold dreams. You're really kind of not following the status quo. If you notice, you start to see that, hey, sometimes things get really tricky. Is it me? Probably not, probably a little bit, but regardless, it's you and it's your big life, and you only get one of them. So let's set you up for success so you can make that big life absolutely everything that you hope and wish it to be. So, my friends, that's it for today. I hope that just kind of warmed you up to this idea. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for spending time with me, listening to this. Again, please feel free to share this. And again, I appreciate that we are able to engage in this way. If you have any questions, wonderments, reach out. We're here. And I look forward to continuing this conversation next time. Bye for now. Thank you for spending time with this podcast episode today. I hope you found something helpful in Resiliency Redefined. Please feel free to share it with somebody who you might think could benefit. Maybe there was something useful, something in particular that you think you could pay forward. Also, if you have a moment, please feel free to rate and review this podcast wherever you like to listen to your podcast. It means the world to me. And again, thanks for your time. Thank you for your interest. Take good care, and I'll see you next time.